Hello again, and welcome to another GCSE Computer Science Theory lesson. This video is going to be on Unit 8, Writing Essays. So, as I mentioned in a previous video, essays are not particularly well liked by most students. If you feel uncomfortable when it comes to writing essays, you are not alone. Most students feel the same way, and most teachers feel the same way when it comes to writing essays, especially when it comes to marking them. So, to try and help with that, I've come up with a step-by-step process to try and take away some of the ambiguity of writing essays. So here is a step-by-step algorithm that you can follow to help you write an essay in the exam. So step 1, we're going to stay calm. Step 2, we are going to read the question. This is sometimes known as read the full question. Step 3, we're going to make a plan. So we're going to plan out our essay, and then finally we're going to write the essay. But don't worry, I'm going to talk about these steps in more detail on the next slides. So I'm going to level with you. We're going to stay calm, but I'm going to tell you about how this thing is marked. So essays aren't marked the way you think they would be. So I'm going to give you the unofficial down low on how these things are actually marked. So here's a typical mark scheme for an essay question that's out of 12 marks. And see this column on the right where we've got, between 10 and 12 and 1 and 3 and all that kind of stuff. This isn't really what's followed. I mean, you might have an exam question that's out of 12 marks, but we're not really looking at the number of marks. Usually the examiner just decides whether your work is going to be good, okay, or rubbish. So really, no matter how many marks your question is out of, your examiner is just going to be thinking, is it good, mediocre, or garbage? Just 3 levels is what's going on, really. Okay, so we've stayed calm. We understand how this thing is kind of marked, really. Oh, and just sort of going back to this graph again, when it comes to preparing for the exam, I expect no student to be trying to aim for this category. Nobody is going to go in the exam and think, I'm going to try and get 12 out of 12 marks for the essay. That's not a good strategy. When you're preparing for these essays, you should just be thinking, I'm going to try my best to be green rather than red. So when you're preparing for this, and when I prepare my students, we're talking about staying in the green rather than going into the red. We definitely don't really talk about, am I 11 out of 12 or am I 6 out of 12? In reality, the essay isn't marked this way. Okay, so once we've calmed down and we understand how it's marked, we move on to step 2, which is read the full question. So here's a question example for you. It's out of 9 marks. Cloud computing is hip and trendy. Explain the reasons for blah, 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 legal, ethical, and environmental issues relating to the use of cloud storage. So cloud storage, legal, ethical, and environmental. Okay, so we've read the question. Now we make a plan. So step 3 is we make a plan. And when I say a plan, I don't mean making some kind of crazy flow diagram or mind map or something with like lines and highlighting and all that junk. I just mean just a list of bullet points. A list of bullet points on a scrap piece of paper. So you're going to have to be brave in the exam. Put your hand up and ask an invigilator to give you a bit of scrap paper to write some bullet points on. And the way I like to do it is break down the question. So we need legal, ethical, environmental, and just write those down as bullet points. And I've done this into sub-bullet points. So I've got legal pro and con, ethical pro and con, and environmental pro and con. Once you've made your bullet points, we're going to start adding some ideas to each bullet point. So, for example, a legal pro or a legal advantage of cloud storage is that police can access criminal accounts if their accounts are on the cloud. However, a legal disadvantage of cloud storage is that cloud storage are more likely to be hacked because data is always online. An ethical advantage or an ethical pro of cloud storage is that cloud storage is good for poor people. Now I'm going to stop here and talk about the written quality of my notes so far. I mean, a lot of you will read this and think that reads quite juvenile. It sounds a bit childish the way I've written this, or maybe the English isn't particularly great. Well, that doesn't matter. This is just a rough plan. The examiner isn't going to read the plan that we make, so it's okay for it to be of poor quality. It's okay for it to sound rubbish. This is just for us to write a little plan before we write the main essay. As far as you're concerned, your scrap paper is going to go in the bin when you're finished with the exam. So anyway, moving on. An ethical disadvantage is that the government can spy on you. An environmental pro, well, we could say cloud storage is good for the environment because mobile devices consume less power. And environmental con, so something that's bad for the environment, cloud servers could actually be bad for the environment because they consume lots of power. Some of these points aren't well developed. So this one, for example, doesn't really make sense on its own. Why are we talking about mobile devices? Well, like I said, this is just a rough plan. It doesn't really have to make sense because it's not being marked. This is just me jotting down some points ready to write my essay. Now, before I turn this into an essay, I'm going to tell you what kind of grade we're on track with this plan so far. I would put it in the red category. So if this was converted into an essay, it would, unfortunately, this plan so far would gear you up for a pretty bad score. The reason for that is because we've not read the full question. So if we go back to this one here, if I was grading this plan, if we turn this plan into an essay, it would probably be in the rubbish category. Why is that? Because we didn't read this properly. We need to talk about the reasons for the large growth of cloud storage. The reason why I'm making such a big deal about this, the reason why I deliberately didn't read this when we first started planning, is because it's a common mistake for students to make. From my experience of teaching this subject, most students will lose their marks from not reading the question properly. I mean, a lot of students are worried about losing marks because of spelling and grammar and punctuation. It's not really because of that. The majority of the time, students lose marks because they don't read the question. So I've updated my plan to include the reasons for large growth, and I came up with the following reasons. Because internet is getting faster, because there is better mobile data coverage, and because, well, smartphones are more popular. And smartphones, because they're not as powerful as desktop computers, they have a need for cloud storage to look after their files and process data for them. So once we've got ourselves a completed plan, a plan that could potentially get us in the green category, we need to start converting it into an essay. And I would suggest when you're writing your essays, just have one sentence to introduce the essay, and then one sentence to end the essay. And then in the middle, you can have about 2 or 3 paragraphs to explain these points that you've made. So if it was me doing this, I would probably put a paragraph that just talks about legal issues, a paragraph for ethical issues, and then a paragraph for environmental issues. I'd probably put growth reasons in the introduction, or I'd probably put it at the bottom of the essay in the end. So here we go. Here's my example. I've got large growth mentioned in the first paragraph in the introduction. I've got the legal issues in its own paragraph, ethical in its own paragraph, and environmental in its own paragraph. Now you'll notice I've not got an ending sentence. I didn't feel it was necessary because I'd written such a large introduction that comprehensively covered the large growth of cloud storage. Now if I was marking this, I would certainly put this at the top of the green category. However, there are some issues with it, and these issues, you might pick them up if you were an English teacher or if you had a flair for English literature. But you have to remember, at the end of the day, this is GCSE computer science, not GCSE English. So the people marking this exam aren't going to be too hot on the spelling and grammar. So I'm sure some of you reading this might notice some spelling mistakes, Some of you reading this might notice some grammar errors. Chances are, if they're very minor, the person marking this probably won't spot them either because they're an ICT teacher, not an English teacher. So, for example, there's a situation here where I've been using unnecessary commas. An English teacher would spot that and mark me down, but an IC teacher probably isn't going to spot that and therefore probably wouldn't penalise me. Another thing is that this phrase here, ethically cloud storage is good. That's not particularly mature or good English. That sounds quite juvenile. Your English teacher might tell you off for saying that, but the ICT teacher, who is the examiner, isn't going to care, or they probably won't care because, well, English isn't their speciality. So you can get away with things like this in the exam.